Hello, my friend. Today, I will tell you another long-forgotten legend. Close your eyes and let the magic transport you to Middle-earth. Our journey begins. In the long twilight of the north, when the kingdom of Arnor was a shadow of its former glory, dark tidings came from beyond the frozen hills. Far away in the blackened lands of Angmar, a terrible power stirred. The Witch-king, lord of sorcery, had arisen anew, and his heart was filled with hatred for the Dúnedain, the men of the west. For many years, the Seven Fortresses had stood proud against the gathering dark. These were ancient strongholds carved of gray stone and crowned with banners of silver and blue. Each fortress was a beacon of hope, a wall against the storms of evil that prowled the borders. They were manned by brave captains, descendants of Numor, whose swords had once challenged the might of Morgoth himself. But time is a silent enemy, and the glory of Arnor had waned. Its people had grown fewer, its warriors stretched thin across the wild lands. Yet still they held to their oaths. They guarded the greenways and the great roads, kept safe the villages that dotted the wind-swept plains, and lit fires on their towers when the nights grew too deep. It was in the bitter month of Nebalith, when the last leaves clung to the barren trees, that the first signs of doom were seen. Travelers came south with wild tales of fell spirits riding the wind, of wolves with eyes like burning coals, and of armies gathering in the mists of the north. At Fornost, the chief city of Arnor, the lords of the Dúnedain held council. In the high hall of the king's house, beneath tapestries that told the tales of old victories, men spoke in grim voices. "The Witch-king musters his hosts," said Malor, captain of the guard. His mail was bright, but there were gray strands in his hair. Already he has sent out spies and saboteurs. The northern watchtower reports fires on the hills, and strange voices cry in the night. Elendil, the king's heir, stood beside him, his hand resting upon the hilt of his sword, Narsillion. His eyes, keen and sad, swept the gathered captains. "Then let us be swift," he said. "The seven fortresses must be warned, their gates must be sealed, their walls strengthened. If they fall, the heart of Arnor is laid bare." And so messengers were sent riding swift as hawks to the scattered fortresses. Amon Sûl with its great seeing stone, Caram on the far frontier, Tyr watching the gray waters, and others whose names were etched into song and stone. But the Witch-king had foreseen this. His sorcery was deep, his malice boundless. Before the warnings could reach their mark, his armies fell like a thunderstorm upon the first of the fortresses. Mine's Ethel, the Tower of the Moon, which stood upon a crag above the misty downs. The defenders of Mus Ethel were valiant. They closed their iron gates and lined the battlements with bowmen. Long into the night they held against the tide, loosing arrows that sang like the wind and struck down the shadowy shapes below. Fires roared and siege engines groaned. The ground shook with the Witch-king's spells. A treachery had crept within their walls. A man thought to be faithful opened a hidden gate in the darkest hour before dawn. The enemy poured in like a flood. The slaughter was swift and cruel. The banner of Minas Ethel, silver and white, was torn down, and in its place was raised a black standard bearing the iron crown of Angmar. When word of the fall reached Fornost, a silence deeper than any speech fell upon the council. Elendil bowed his head, and Malor struck the hilt of his sword against the stone floor in grief. Thus the first of the seven fortresses fell. The lords of Arnor did not weep long. They girded themselves anew, knowing that the enemy would not pause. Like wolves tasting blood, the hosts of Angmar would press their advantage. Already beyond the snowy ridges, a second army stirred, blackening the land like a crawling shadow. At Dúnedain, the second fortress, the horns had sounded. Watchfires burned high into the night. Captain Berian, a hardy lord of great renown, stood upon the battlements, his cloak snapping in the wind. "Let them come," he said, his voice grim. "The walls of Caiodaren are thick, and the hearts of my men thicker still." His men cheered, for Barone was beloved, and his courage kindled their own. But even as they cheered, the Witch-king smiled a cruel smile beyond the hill. For he knew that stone and iron, though mighty, were not enough against the black arts he wielded. The battle for Caiodaren would be different. No open assault would come at first. Instead, the Witch-king sent dreams of terror and despair into the hearts of the defenders. Men woke screaming in the night, their minds filled with images of burning homes and broken kin. Fear gnawed at them as no blade could. Within a fortnight, discipline faltered. Berian rode among his men, giving speeches, singing the old songs of Newmore. Yet even he could not drive away the creeping dread that clung to every shadow. Then came the second blow. Great plague swept through the fortress, swift and unnatural, felling strong men as easily as babes. The healers wept and tore their garments, for no salve or spell could turn its course. The very air seemed poisoned. At last, with fewer than a third of his men still standing, Bellalone knew the hour was lost. He gathered his captains within the citadel and spoke plainly. "I will not yield to fear," he said. "If we must fall, we shall fall as kings of old, swords in hand, facing the enemy." And so they did. The last stand of Caiodaren was a tale of great bravery, sung by the rangers in years to come. Beren fell upon the stairs of the keep, his sword breaking the helm of a troll, even as black darts pierced his breast. The gates were broken, the walls toppled, and the second fortress was no more. At Fornost, messengers came gasping and broken, bearing word of Caiodarian's fall. Alanthor listened, his face as still as stone. Then he rose and turned to Malor. "We must act," he said. "If the seven fortresses fall, Arnor is doomed." Thus the War of the North raged onward, and the shadow grew deeper. In the bitter days that followed the ruin of Caiodaren, the land itself seemed to mourn. The wind blew cold from the north, carrying with it the ash and scent of burnt fields and the bitter cries of widows. Long plumes of smoke marked the places where villages had once stood, and the roads that had borne the tread of Nummenorian kings now lay broken and empty, save for the furtive passage of wolves and darker things that shunned the daylight. Even the stars above, steadfast through all the long ages of the world, seemed dimmed, veiled by a shadow that crept unseen, but felt by all. Elendil, standing upon the high tower of Fornost, beheld the darkening horizon and felt a heaviness upon his heart that no words could dispel. Often he kept vigil alone, gazing northward with eyes that sought some sign of hope, yet found none. Though he was young among the Dúnedain, there was wisdom in him, a solemn grace inherited from the sea kings of old. And it was said by many that the fates of men had woven about him some secret purpose. Yet now, even he whose courage had kindled the hearts of many found the weight of despair pressing sorely upon him. The council of the North Kingdom gathered again, though their numbers had diminished. for many captains and lords had already fallen with their keeps. In the great hall, beneath the carven arches and the fading banners of Elendil, they spoke in low, grave voices as men speak before the breaking of a storm. Malor, grizzled and scarred by 100 battles, rose and spoke with the voice of one who had borne the burdens of many winters. 2 fortresses have fallen, he said, and the enemy waxes ever stronger. If we hold our strength in one place, we may yet defy him. Let us call back our garrisons and fortify Fornost, and make here our stand. But others were of different mind. Lord Halbarad of Amon Sûl, tall and stern, his gray cloak lined with silver, spoke against it. To abandon the outer defenses is to hasten our ruin. If we retreat, the enemy shall know our weakness and shall come against us in greater wrath. We must send aid to the remaining fortresses, lest they too be cast down, and we find ourselves besieged without hope of relief. Erland listened to their counsels, and when all had spoken, he rose and stood before them. And the hall grew still, for his voice carried the weight of destiny. "We cannot hold all," he said, "for our strength is spent and our numbers too few. Yet neither shall we yield without contest. I shall send forth companies of riders, swift and secret, to the fortresses that yet stand. They shall bear warning and succor, and those who are able shall gather their folk and retreat toward Fornost. But if they cannot be moved, they must be strengthened, and their captains must be given leave to stand or to fall as their wisdom guides them. For whether we will it or no, the final storm draws nigh, and we must be as trees rooted deep against the tempest." Thus it was resolved, and the messengers rode forth into the gathering dark, while at foremost the people made ready for war. Women and children were sent away to hidden refuse in the woods and hills, and the hammer rang loud upon the anvil as new blades were forged and old mail mended. Meanwhile, far to the west, beyond the misty downs and the marshes gray, the third of the 7 fortresses prepared for its trial. Tyr, the Tower of the Sea, was built upon a lonely height overlooking the wide gray waters of Lurn. It had stood since the days when Elendil himself had sailed into Middle-earth, a beacon and a watchtower against the perils of the north and the west. Its walls were white stone, gleaming in the morning light, and from its highest turret flew a banner bearing the star of Elendil. Lord Arondir held command there, a mariner of great renown, whose ships had sailed as far as the icebound seas in the north and the sunset isles of the west. He was a man of great heart and steadfast will, and he had sworn an oath to hold Tyr near against all who would bring ruin to the free peoples. The enemy came not by land alone, but by sea as well. For the Witch-king had gathered to his service creatures of darkness that dwelt beneath the waters, monstrous things of ancient days, whose coming broke the hearts of sailors and sent the waves fleeing in terror. Black ships, crooked and foul, slid out of the northern mists, bearing orcs and men corrupted by the shadow. Erend watched from his tower and knew that his hour had come. He called his captains to him, and they stood upon the battlements while the horns rang out over the gray waters. "We are the last hope of the western marches," he said. "If we fall, the coast shall be overrun and the havens closed. Therefore, we must stand. And if we fall as sons of Numor." The enemy assailed the fortress with fire and sorcery. Great engines hurled burning stones against the walls, and hideous voices shrieked in the night. Yet the defenders fought with all the strength of their proud heritage, and for a time it seemed they might withstand the tide. Days turned to weeks, and the siege dragged on. Supplies dwindled, and the wounded outnumbered the hail. Yet still the men of Tirranir stood firm, singing songs of the sea and the stars, even as the enemy battered at their gates. But the Witch-king had reserved a darker stratagem for this place. In secret, he had commanded that a great spell be wrought, binding the very waters against the defenders. One night, when the moon was shrouded and the winds were still, the sea itself rose in fury. A black wave, taller than the highest tower, thundered against the cliff and the walls, shattering stone as though it were glass. fell beneath the waters, and with it perished Lord Elendil and all his men. It is said that their spirits still sail the gray seas, guarding the coasts against the darkness, even in death. Thus the third fortress was lost. When news of Tirranir's fall reached Fornost, great wailing arose, and even the most stalwart hearts faltered. Yet Elendil did not despair. Standing before the gathered people, he raised his sword high, and its blade caught the light of the setting sun. "Though the darkness deepens," he cried, "we shall not yield. Hope yet remains while we draw breath." The people, seeing his courage, were heartened, though a shadow of fear lay ever heavier upon them. So the war raged on, and the Witch-king's laughter echoed across the ruined fields of the north. Now the winter deepened, and with it the shadow that had crept slowly southward, coiling like a serpent about the last holds of the Dúnedain. The days grew short and the nights longer, and a bitter wind from Angmar swept across the land, freezing the rivers and coating the barren fields in a skin of ice. In the frozen silence, the fortresses that yet stood seemed like ancient relics from a forgotten age. Proud but isolated, their fires burning dim behind thick walls of stone. Among these stood Amon Sûl, the watchtower of the wind, most renowned of the seven. For within its high chamber was kept one of the Palunti, the seeing stones that the lords of old had wrought with wisdom and might. Upon its summit the tower caught the first light of dawn and the last rays of sunset, and from its heights one could gaze far across the leagues of Arnor, even unto the misty marches of the bare-rowed downs and the tumbled hills beyond. Here ruled Lord Arvael, son of Argel, a man of great lineage and stern valor, whose forefathers had worn the crown of Arnor in days when the kingdom stretched unbroken from the lawn to the weather hills. In Amon Sûl he had gathered what strength he could muster, calling to his banners the rangers of the north and the hardy folk of the hill country. They came in twos and threes, grim and silent, their faces weathered by wind and toil, yet their hands steadfast upon spear and sword. For though the line of kings was broken and the realm divided, still there lived in the hearts of the Dúnedain a memory of the ancient pride and a fire that would not be easily quenched. Word reached Arvael of the fall of Tirranir and of the dark hosts that now roamed unhindered across the western shores. Though sorrow weighed heavily upon him, he set his heart like steel against despair and made ready for the siege he knew must come. The gates of Amon Sûl were barred, the walls manned night and day, and great stores of food and water laid up within the fortress. Messengers were sent forth by secret ways to warn the scattered villages and call for aid, but few were they that answered, for the land was already scoured by the Witch-king's minions. Then, upon a night of blackest frost, the hosts of Angmar came at last to Amon Sûl. They poured across the frozen plains in countless numbers, like a dark river bearing torches that flickered like malevolent stars. Their banners bore the sigil of the Iron Crown, and in their van rode creatures of terror, trolls clad in mail of black iron, wargs whose eyes glowed red in the gloom, and men twisted by sorcery, whose souls had long since been given over to shadow. The first assault came with the rising of the blood moon, a terrible onslaught that shook the very stones of the tower. Arvalid stood upon the battlements, clad in mail that gleamed like silver in the torchlight, and at his side was his chief captain, Dirhael, whose voice rang like a trumpet above the clash of arms.
They drove back the first wave, casting down ladders and setting fire to the siege towers, and the defenders cheered, for their courage was not yet broken. But the Witch King was cunning, and he knew that brute force alone would not carry the day. For 7 nights he besieged the tower, each time withdrawing before the dawn, yet leaving behind a gift of dread. The corpses of fallen warriors, risen again under dark enchantments, who clawed at the gates and howled beneath the windows, filling the hearts of the living with terror. Dreams of madness plagued the defenders, and many grew faint-hearted, believing the tower to be cursed. Orvik, perceiving that the spirit of his people was failing faster than their strength, resolved to strike a blow against the enemy before the siege could strangle them completely. Gathering a company of his bravest knights, he rode forth from the gates at midnight, a sudden sortie under the cover of a storm that had risen from the west. They fell upon the enemy with great fury, cutting down captains and shattering the engines of war. And for a moment it seemed that the tide might be turned. But the Witch King was waiting. In the heart of the battlefield he stood a tall and dreadful figure cloaked in shadow, his crown of iron gleaming coldly above unseen brows. In his right hand he bore a great sword wreathed in sorcery, and his voice was as a chill wind that scourged the soul. "Come forth, son of Argiu," he cried, "and meet thy doom." Arvleg, though his heart quailed, did not falter. With a cry he charged, his blade shining with a light that defied the darkness. They met in the midst of the ruin, sword against sword, light against shadow. Long they strove, and the earth trembled beneath their blows. Yet mortal strength could not long withstand the power of Angmar, and in the end, Arvleg fell, his sword broken, his shield sundered. His knights, seeing their lord cast down, fought desperately to recover his body, and by great valor they bore him back within the gates. But the heart of the tower was broken. That very night the Witch King unleashed a sorcery more terrible than any yet seen. A black fire that consumed stone and flesh alike, licking up the walls of Amon Sûl as though they were dry wood. The tower fell, and with it the Palantir was lost, though none knew whither it had gone, save perhaps the enemy himself. Thus perished Amon Sûl, the greatest of the 7 fortresses, and the hope of the north grew dim indeed. At Fornost, when tidings of this ruin were brought, the people wept openly, for they had loved Arvialg, and the loss of the Seeing Stone filled them with foreboding. Elendil withdrew to the halls of his fathers, and there communed long with Malor and the wise among the Dúnedain. For they knew now that the Witch King would not be turned aside, and that soon he would cast his full might against Fornost itself. Yet even in that darkest hour, the spirit of the Dúnedain did not wholly fail. For among them were still those who remembered the pride of Numor and the long defeat they had waged against the Shadow. They knew that though towers might fall and kings perish, yet the seed of hope could not be wholly destroyed, while even one remained to carry it. And so they made ready for the days to come, grim and unyielding, as winter deepened its grip upon the dying kingdom. The snows fell heavily upon the hills of Arnor, cloaking the land in white silence, as if the world itself sought to hide from the sorrow that spread like a stain across the kingdom. In hidden valleys and forested glens,
The folk of the Dúnedain kindled small fires and spoke in hushed voices, fearful that even their words might summon the dread hosts of Angmar. Yet in the strongholds that still remained, the captains and warriors held their vigil, for they knew that the Witch-king would not allow them long to mourn the fall of Amon Sûl. Upon the eastern marches, where the wild lands stretched toward the weather hills, stood Barad Gevaron, the Tower of the Wind's Cry, named for the fierce storms that beat unceasingly against its lonely walls. Though it was lesser in fame than Amon Sûl, its position was of great import, guarding the eastern approaches to Fornost. Here ruled Lady Fendula, a woman of proud bearing and unbending will, sister to Arvail, and a beacon of hope to those who yet resisted the encroaching dark. And the tidings of her brother's fall were borne to her by the last desperate riders of Amon Sûl. She did not weep nor break in spirit, but instead she arrayed her garrison for war. Standing upon the battlements, clad in a mail shirt of Mithil, and bearing a spear whose head shone like a star even under the wan light of the winter sun. Under her command were men of Arnor, rangers of the wild, and a handful of elves from Lindon who had come eastward to lend what aid they might before the storm should swallow all. The Witch-king, learning of the strength yet hidden within Barad Gevaron, sent forth a host to break it, greater in number than any yet dispatched. They came in a black tide, orcs and fellmen mingled together, their banners tattered, but their will sharpened by the cold and by the malice of their master. They ringed the tower in a siege of fire and steel, and the air was filled with the ceaseless din of drums and the wailing of harsh horns. Lady Fendula stood upon the high tower and beheld the darkness that had come against her. Yet no fear touched her countenance, and her voice, clear and proud, was carried upon the wind to all who stood with her. "Let the enemy come," she cried, "for though we stand alone upon this wind-cored rock, we are not forgotten by the valor, nor by those whose blood flows with the memory of new morn." Thus encouraged, her warriors fought with a fierceness born of desperation and loyalty, repelling the first assaults with bow and blade, casting down the ladders and breaking the siege engines with fire and cunning. The elves loosed their arrows with deadly precision, and for many days it seemed that Barad Gevaron might endure a shining thorn in the Witch-king's side. But the Lord of Angmar was not one to be thwarted by valor alone. From his dark halls he sent forth a new terror, a creature of ancient days, wrought by Morgoth in the elder times, and hidden in the deep places of the world. It was a fell beast, vast and winged, whose cry could turn the bravest heart to ice, and whose breath was a pestilence that withered stone and flesh alike. Upon a night of bitter cold, when the stars were veiled and the moon rode low and sickly in the sky, the creature came, descending from the heavens like a thunderbolt. Its wings blotted out the stars, and its coming was heralded by a shriek so dreadful that many who heard it fell senseless upon the ground. With talons like iron hooks, it tore at the battlements, and its jaws gaped wide to vomit forth black fire against the walls. But Alice, seeing that no mortal weapon could prevail against such a foe, gathered her captains and made ready for a final stand. Together they ascended the tower, carrying with them the most ancient relics of their house, lest they fall into the hands of the enemy. Upon the pinnacle they lit a great beacon, a flame of defiance whose light could be seen from the far hills where the last rangers watched and wept. Then the creature fell upon the tower with all its fury, and the stones themselves shuddered under its assault. Findalis, undaunted, cast her spear with all her strength, and it flew true, striking the beast upon the eye. It gave a scream that shook the mountains, and for a moment it reeled, but the wound was not mortal, and with a final stroke of its wings, it smoked the tower to ruin. Thus perished Barad Agaron and Lady Findalis, who stood to the end against the dark, and whose name is remembered in song by the few who survived those bitter days. The news of this loss came at last to Fornost, borne by a handful of rangers who had escaped the ruin. There was a great silence among the people. Even the children ceased their play, sensing in their hearts the weight of the tidings. Elendil wept openly, for he had loved Findalis, and he knew that with her fall, a light had gone out that would not easily be rekindled. Malor, grim-faced and weary beyond his years, spoke to the gathered council, his voice low but resolute.
4 fortresses have fallen. The enemy draws ever nearer. Yet while we breathe, we shall not yield.
Thus the North Kingdom, battered and broken, still clung to life, a fading ember in the storm. But the Witch-king was relentless, and already he had turned his gaze upon the 5th fortress, nestled deep within the hidden valleys of the south, beyond the great forests of Minrioth, where the rivers cut deep into the hills and the trees stood tall and ancient as the memories of the world. There lay the hidden valley of Ninuil, and there upon its northern shore rose the fortress of Tau Barad. It was a stronghold seldom spoken of in the great tales, for it was a place of quiet strength, built not for glory, but for endurance, and those who dwelt within its walls were the wardens of the wild places, the guardians of the forgotten paths. At Tower Barbad ruled Lord Brigalis, a man of few words and steady hand, whose loyalty to the house of Elendil was as the roots of the mountains, deep and unshakable. His people were hearty and close to the land woodsmen and hunters who knew the secret ways of the forest and whose eyes were keen to the movements of the enemy. They had held back the incursions of Angmar for many years, striking from shadow and mist, ever retreating before the great hosts, but never wholly yielding. And their defiance was a thorn that the Witch-king now turned his malice to remove. Long before the dark banners were seen upon the hills, Brigalos knew that the storm was coming. The trees whispered warnings in the night, and the beasts of the forest fled southward in silent terror. Strange lights moved in the sky, and the stars themselves seemed to tremble at the approach of the great evil. Summoning his captains, Brigalis spoke with a calm that belied the grimness of his tidings. "The tide is upon us," he said. "We cannot stand against it in open battle, nor can we hope for rescue. Therefore, we must fight as we have always fought, with cunning, with patience, and with a fire in our hearts that no darkness can quench." Thus he set his people to prepare, not merely to defend the fortress, but to vanish into the land itself, to wage a war of shadows against the hosts of Angmar. The walls of Tor Barad were strengthened, the stores laid deep in secret caverns, and the women and children were sent away by hidden paths to the safety of the southern woods. Yet the warriors remained grim and silent beneath the eaves of the forest, awaiting the hour when their strength would be tested. When at last the vanguard of the Witch-king's army appeared upon the northern ridges, it was not in the form of great battalions or thundering engines of war, but rather as a creeping tide of darkness spreading through the trees like a poison, silent and deadly. Wraiths and corrupted beasts, things unseen by mortal eyes for many ages, slithered through the undergrowth, seeking the hidden defender. Black sorcery befouled the rivers and tainted the air, so that even the hardy men of Torad found their strength failing, and their hearts growing heavy with dread. For many days and nights the siege was not of walls, but of the spirit.
Scouts sent beyond the lines did not return. Fires lit upon distant hills were answered only by mocking flames in the night. Fear, more deadly than any sword, gnawed at the courage of the defenders. Then, upon a mist-laden morning, the main host of Angmar descended at last, a black flood that seemed to choke the very life from the land. Orcs clad in heavy armor, trolls bearing cruel siege hammers, and dark men whose loyalty had been bought with gold and fear pressed forward to encircle Torbur. At their head rode a figure cloaked in shadows deeper than night, and though none dared name him aloud, all knew it was the Witch-king himself, come to see the ruin of the fortress with his own terrible eyes. Bregalis ordered that the gates be barred and the walls defended with all craft and valor, but he knew in his heart that the fortress could not be held forever. Secretly, he dispatched small bands of his warriors to slip away under cover of darkness to carry on the fight in the wild, for he believed that the survival of his people mattered more than the stones of Tor Barat. The first assaults came swiftly, a tempest of iron and fire, but the defenders met them with a ferocity that belied their small numbers. Arrows rained down from the battlements, and boiling oil was poured upon the siege ladders. Again and again the enemy was driven back, their dead heaped before the walls in grotesque heaps. Yet the Witch-king was patient as a spider with its prey. He wove his enchantments about the fortress, sending dreams of betrayal and despair among the defenders. Friends turned their swords against one another in the night, and whispers of doom filled the darkened halls. Slowly, inexorably, the strength of Tower Barad was sapped, not by force of arms alone, but by the wearing down of hope. At last, upon a night, when the stars were hidden and a black mist covered the land, the final blow was struck. A great battering ram, shaped like the maw of some ancient beast, was brought forth, and under cover of sorcery it was driven against the gates. Though they had been wrought of the strongest iron and bound with spells of warding, they could not long withstand the fury of the assault. Regos gathered his last warriors within the courtyard and spoke to them plainly. "This night we fall," he said. "Yet let us fall in such a fashion that the enemy shall remember our defiance. Let them pay dearly for every stone they take, and may our deaths buy time for those who will yet strike back against the darkness." With that they set their hands to their swords and spears and made ready for the final charge. When the gates burst open with a scream of riven iron, the defenders of Torbar hurled themselves against the foe with a cry that shook even the hearts of the orcs. They fought from courtyard to tower, from tower to keep, until the stones ran red with blood and the smoke of burning rose high into the night sky. Bregalis himself slew the captain of the enemy host upon the steps of the great hall before he was at last overwhelmed by sheer number. Thus fell Tower Barad, the fifth of the seven fortresses, and with its fall the southern ways lay open to the armies of Angmar. At Fornost the beacon fires burned low, and the faces of the people grew more with each passing day. Yet Elendil still stood firm, and though the burden of sorrow grew ever heavier upon him, he neither faltered nor gave voice to despair. For he knew that if hope was to endure, it must be kindled anew in the hearts of the living, and not laid to rest among the stones of the fallen. Thus the long winter wore on, and the last strongholds of Arnor waited in grim silence for the coming storm. Through the long and bitter days of deep winter, the land of Arnor lay stricken beneath a pall of sorrow, and the works of men grew cold and still beneath the relentless advance of the shadow. The winds carried with them the stench of burning and death,
and the once proud highways of the North Kingdom were now but broken paths, haunted by beasts and darker things that crept in the twilight.
Yet among the high hills and deep dales of the land, there remained two fortresses that yet held out against the tides of ruin: Dolhira and Eärendor, the last outposts of hope against the waxing might of Angmar Heroth. The Tower of the Highwood was a stronghold built upon a great mound where once a sacred grove of ancient trees had stood, their roots older than the coming of the elves. Though the trees were long gone, their memory seemed to linger in the stones, and many whispered that some old magic yet lay sleeping there, offering shelter against the despair that now blanketed the world. Its walls were fashioned from dark green stone, quarried from the nearby cliffs, and in the fading light they seemed to blend with the hills themselves, as though the fortress were a part of the land, and not set upon it by mortal hands. Here ruled Lord Elendil, a wise and far-sighted leader, whose hair was white with the snows of many winters, but whose hand had lost none of its strength. He had once sat at the feet of the lore masters of Fornost, learning the histories of Númenor and the wisdom of the Eldar. And it was said that he knew the secret names of stars and could speak to the great eagles that sometimes passed high above the mountains. Beneath his guidance, Dolahar had long endured, a haven for those who had fled the ravages of the north and west, and its halls rang with the voices of those who still dared to sing of the elder days. Yet even Volondal could not blind himself to the grim tidings that came daily to his gates. Riers, who had once been sent abroad to spy the movements of the enemy, now returned with tales of villages razed to the ground, of whole valleys emptied of life, and of the inexorable march of the Witch-king's forces southward. The beacons that had once blazed proudly upon the hilltops were dark, and few now dared the open roads, save for the desperate or the doomed. Knowing that the day of testing drew near, Elendil gathered all who could bear arms within the fortress and fortified every wall and tower. Great cauldrons of boiling pitch were prepared. Hidden wells were unsealed, and secret tunnels opened to provide a means of escape or counterattack should the walls be breached. The people labored without rest, for they knew that their survival depended not only upon strength of arms, but upon cunning and resolve. Thus, when the vanguard of the enemy at last appeared upon the forest fringes, Dolhireth was ready. The assault was led by a dark captain of Angmar, whose name is not remembered, for it was blotted out from all songs and histories by the blackness of his deeds. His host was not the great throng that had overthrown Amon Sûl or Torbered, but rather a company of select warriors and sorcerers, chosen for their cruelty and skill in the arts of death. They came clad in cloaks of shadow and bore weapons that gleamed with an unholy light, and their coming was heralded by a silence so profound that even the birds fled from the skies. They set siege to Droth, not by overwhelming force, but by craft and guile. Each night they crept close to the walls, weaving spells of confusion and dread, until the defenders scarce knew whether they were awake or dreaming. Fires were kindled in the woods, casting leaping shadows upon the fortress walls, and strange voices whispered at the gates, calling the names of the defenders in the tongues of the dead. Elendil, perceiving the nature of the assault, countered with the old wisdom he had learned in his youth. He bathed the minstrels of the fortress to sing the songs of Elendil and the lays of the West, and their clear, pure voices rose into the night, breaking the webs of fear spun by the enemy. He ordered that the fires be kept burning upon the battlements without cease, for light is the enemy of shadow. And within those walls hope was kept alive through song and flame.
Yet the Witch-king, hearing of the resistance at Dol Harad, grew wroth, and he sent forth a greater host, led by a creature of dread, a spirit of malice, housed in a body of shifting darkness, who could pass through walls as smoke and turn men's hearts to ash with a glance. This being, known only as the Nameless, descended upon Dol Harad with a shriek that tore the night onder. For 3 days and nights the battle raged, a terrible contest of will and strength. The defenders fought with a fury born of despair, hurling back assault after assault. Archers lined the walls, pouring shafts into the black masses below. Stones and fire rained from the towers, and in the courtyards, men and women alike took up arms to resist the invaders. Seeing that the walls must fall, Elendil ordered the children and the weakest among his people to flee through the secret tunnels into the woods beyond, while he and the remaining warriors made ready for their final stand. When the gates were breached, Elendil stood at their threshold, clad in white mail, his sword gleaming like a star fallen to earth. With a cry that recalled the glory of lost Numor, he led the charge into the ranks of the enemy, and so fierce was his onset that even the Nameless fell back before him. For a moment it seemed that light might triumph over darkness, but the shadow was too great and the defenders too few. One by one, the last warriors of Dol Harad fell until Elendil alone stood amidst the ruin. Raising his sword high, he cried aloud in the ancient tongue of his people, a final defiance. And with that cry, he fell, surrounded by the slain. Thus ended the tale of Dol Harad, and with its fall, the hope of the south grew faint indeed. The survivors who fled into the woods carried with them the memory of that final stand, and in secret glades and hidden halls, they spoke of Elendil's valor, kindling a spark of resistance that would not easily be quenched. Even as the shadow deepened over the north, at Fornost the bells tolled in mourning, and Elendil, standing before the dwindling council of his captains, knew that the last walls were falling, and that soon the final trial of the North Kingdom would be at hand. In the cold stillness that followed the ruin of Dol Harad, a hush fell over the land, as if the very earth mourned the passing of its defenders. The forests of Minhir stood silent and empty. The rivers ran sluggish beneath a shroud of mist, and no voice of bird or beast was heard upon the hills. The shadow that spread from Angmar grew heavier with each passing day, and even in the secret places where the last free folk hid themselves, hope waned, and the light of joy grew dim. Yet amid the ruin, one fortress still stood, clinging to the rocky highlands above the southern marches. Arendor, the Tower of the Green Vale. Arendor was not a fortress of grandeur or mighty walls, but rather of fastness built in harmony with the land itself. Its halls were carved into the living rock, and its towers rose among the trees as though they had sprung from the earth, shaped by ancient hands before the reckoning of years. The vale below it, once a place of gardens and laughter, had long been abandoned to the wild. But within Rindor, the flame of the Dúnedain endured, guarded by the hand of Lord Farvel, last of a noble line that traced its descent to the captains of Elendil. Fever was a man of middle years, broad of shoulder and keen of eye, in whom the wisdom of age was mingled with the vigor of youth. He had long prepared Erdor for siege, knowing that the day would come when the north would no longer shield him, and his people were few but steadfast, their hearts hardened by many trials. They had watched the fall of their sister fortresses with sorrow and grim resolve, vowing that they would not be taken unawares when the hosts of Angmar at last turned their gaze upon them. Yet even Thrall, who had foreseen much, could not have dreamed of the full horror that the Witch-king would unleash upon the last bastion of the south. For the enemy, perceiving that Arendor was the final thorn in his side before he could sweep unhindered across the plains to Fornost, gathered his strength for a blow that would not merely destroy the fortress, but erase it utterly from memory. From the ruins of the other fortresses came remnants of dark armies, reforged and made more terrible by sorcery. Orcs in iron raiment, hill trolls of immense stature, wraiths robed in gray mist, and darker things that had no name in the tongues of men, moved southward like a rolling storm. Above them circled fell beasts, riders clad in shadow, whose piercing cries turned blood to ice. At their head came the Witch-king himself, robed in mail black as the void between the stars, his iron crown gleaming with a cruel light. The people of Arendor, gazing from their hidden watch, beheld the gathering darkness and knew that their end was near. Yet they did not despair, for they had made their peace with doom and chose to face it with a courage worthy of song. The gates were sealed, the walls made ready, and the warriors took their places, each man and woman vowing to sell their lives dearly. The siege began at dusk, when the red light of the sun was swallowed by an unnatural gloom, and the hosts of Angmar poured into the vale like a flood released from the mountains. The first assault was of brute force, a thunderous crash of rams against the outer gates, and a rain of fire launched from engines of war. Baravel and his captains stood firm, leading seas from the hidden passages to strike at the enemy's flanks, and for a time the defenders held their own, their spirits lifted by each small victory. But the Witch-king was not a foe to be defeated by courage alone. In the dark of the second night, he unleashed a sorcery woven from the deepest pits of despair. A black mist rose from the earth, creeping into every crevice and hall, chilling the marrow of even the bravest to the core. Dreams of ruin and betrayal assailed the defenders in their sleep, and many awoke with cries of terror, seeing phantoms where none stood. Trust faltered, and friends looked with suspicion upon one another. Farel, perceiving that the spirit of his people was under attack, ordered that no one sleep alone, and that the halls be filled with music and speech. For as long as voice and song endured, the shadow could not wholly claim them. The harpists and singers labored night and day, and the ancient songs of the Dúnedain echoed through the stone chambers, a defiance to the sorcery that gnawed at their souls. Yet no defensive spirit could long delay the fall of stone. On the fourth day, the great outer gate was breached, torn under by a beast whose form was lost in the blackness that cloaked it, a creature of fangs and iron claws. It smashed the way open for the hosts of Angmar, and the defenders were driven back to the inner court. Fair Faith made his final stand, calling to him all who could still bear arms. He led them into the high hall of Arendor, where the banners of his house still hung, faded but proud. There, beneath the carved columns of ancient oak and stone, they prepared to meet the end. The enemy poured into the hall, their dark shapes filling the sacred place with a mockery of life. The clash of steel rang loud, and the air was filled with cries of defiance and death. Farewell, wielding the sword of his fathers, cut a path through the enemy ranks, and his captains fought beside him with a fury that made even the Witch-king himself pause in his advance. At last, surrounded and pressed back to the dais where the throne of Arendor stood, Farel turned to those who remained. "Let the last stand of Arendor be worthy of our fathers," he said. "For even in ruin, honor endures." With that he raised his sword in salute, and with a cry that rang through the shattered halls, he led the final charge. They fell, one by one, each cut down in turn, until farewell alone stood against the Witch-king. The Lord of Angar raised his black blade, and in that moment all light seemed to die. Thus fell Elendil, the last of the Seven Fortresses, and the way to Fornost lay open.
Now came the final dread upon the North Kingdom, for with the fall of Elendil, there remained no barrier between Fornost and the black tide of Angmar. The ruin of the Seven Fortresses was complete, and the Witch-king, having crushed every bulwark that might delay his coming, turned his full wrath upon the ancient capital of Arnor. The green hills that once bore the laughter of free folk and the glimmer of banners in the summer breeze were now but a withered land, scorched by fire and trampled by the feet of countless enemies. And the dark hosts of the north marched in ranks that defiled the earth with their passing. In Fornost, the city of kings, fear and sorrow walked hand in hand. Yet still the people labored, for Elendil, a son of the king, had not faltered in his purpose. In the great courts of the city, hammers rang upon anvils, and the forges blazed day and night, crafting weapons for hands that had never before borne sword or shield. Young and old men and women alike were gathered to the defense, for none could now stand apart from the coming battle. The streets that had once echoed with music and the busy life of trade now bristled with barricades. The gardens of the houses were torn up for firewood, and the grand fountains ran dry, their waters stored against the siege to come. Elendil himself moved among the people, speaking to them not as a lord to his vassals, but as a captain to his comrades. Clad in a simple hauberk of bright mail and bearing the sword Narsillion at his side, he gave strength to many who might otherwise have given in to despair. In him the blood of Elendil ran strong, and the memory of Numor seemed to stir anew, so that even the oldest of the Dúnedain looked upon him with wonder, and whispered that perhaps, even in this dark hour, hope was not wholly lost. Malo, captain of the guard, stood ever at Elendil's side, grim and tireless, his sword hand never far from the hilt. Together they oversaw the fortifications of Fornost, strengthening the walls with timber and stone, setting watchfires upon the towers, and drilling the defenders in the arts of war. The city's gates were reinforced with iron bands and bolts, and within the citadel the relics of old were gathered, lest they fall into the hands of the enemy should the worst befall. Messengers were sent to the scattered remnants of the people in the countryside, calling all who could still fight to rally to Fornost. But few answered, for the land between had become a barren waste, prowled by wraiths and wolves. Even the rangers, who once roamed freely through the wilds, found themselves hunted like deer in the deep woods, and many perished unseen, their names known only to the stars. Yet despite all preparations, Elendil knew in his heart that the strength of Fornost was not enough to withstand the full might of the Witch-king. In secret council, he spoke with Mor and the few captains who remained. And there, in the high chamber of the king's house, beneath the faded banners of Arnor's former glory, he laid bare the grim truth. "We cannot hope to hold the city if the Witch-king brings his power against us," he said. "He has broken the Seven Fortresses. He has scattered our people. He has darkened the land from the misty mountains to the sea. No wall of stone, however strong, can stand against such might for long." Malor, whose face was lined with sorrow and fatigue, answered him. "Then what would you have us do, my lord? If we abandon Fornost, we lose the heart of our realm and all that remains of our people's hope." Elendil looked out from the high windows of the hall across the rolling hills now wrapped in mist and shadow, and his voice, though low, was clear. "We shall not abandon Fornost," he said. We shall stand and fight, and buy with our lives whatever time we may, that the last remnants of our people may escape into the wilds. The seed of the Dúnedain must endure, though the tree fall in ruin. In secret shall our heirs wander, hidden from the enemy's sight, until a day comes when the west wind blows again and hope is reborn. Thus was the grim purpose set, and the captains, though their hearts were heavy, swore their oaths anew and made ready for the final defense. Riders were dispatched by secret ways to carry the young and the helpless to the distant havens of the south and west, where the shadow had not yet fallen in full. Elendil bade farewell to those he loved, knowing he would not look upon their faces again, and returned to the walls to await the coming of the storm. It was upon the eve of the spring equinox, when the last snows melted into the rivers and the first pale blossoms dared to unfurl upon the thorny boughs, that the armies of Angmar were first glimpsed from the watchtowers of Fornost. A black river they seemed, flowing down from the hills in endless ranks, their banners tattered but numerous, their horns sounding a dirge that chilled the blood. Orcs and trolls, men enslaved by dark sorcery, beasts of malice, and other creatures more terrible and less named pressed forward beneath the iron will of the Witch-king who rode at their head, a tall figure crowned with iron, and behind him came riders upon fell beasts circling like vultures above a dying land. The defenders of Fornost stood upon the walls, their hearts beating with the grim resolve of those who know they face certain death, yet who choose defiance nonetheless. No trembling was seen among them, no flight or cowardice marred their ranks. Rather, they set their shields and made ready their bows, and upon the battlements torches flared into life as if to challenge the oncoming night. Elendil, mounted upon a great horse, his sword unchased and gleaming in the firelight, rode along the line of his warriors, speaking words of courage and remembrance. "This is our hour," he said, "the hour for which our fathers prepared us, the hour in which the deeds of the past and the hope of the future meet. We are the last of the kings of Arnor. We are the last shield of the free peoples of the north. Let us show the enemy that even in defeat we are not broken, that though the walls may fall and our bodies perish, our spirit shall endure." A great cheer rose from the walls, and the sound echoed across the plain, defying the darkness. Then came the first assault. The assault fell upon Fornost like a hammer blow struck by the hand of some dark and merciless god. And the walls, long silent save for the whisper of the wind, now echoed with the clash of iron and the cry of mortal men. The forces of Angmar surged forward, a living tide of malice and ruin, and their assault was met with arrow and spear, with the fire of burning oil and the grim resolve of those who had nothing left to lose but their arm. On the battlements, the doomed fought with a fury kindled by despair, and every stone of the ancient city seemed to groan under the weight of that desperate valor. Wave upon wave the enemy hurled against the walls, and many times they were thrown back, leaving the fields strewn with the broken bodies of orc and troll. Yet each assault sapped the strength of the defenders, each victory paid for with blood too precious to spare. The defenders of Fornost knew that they fought not for victory, but for the memory of their forebears, for the hope that somewhere beyond the ruin of their city, the line of Elendil might yet endure. Through the smoke and din of battle, Elendil moved like a beacon of light, his sword flashing as he led sorties against the attackers wherever the need was greatest. At his side rode Malor, grim as a winter storm, and together they heartened the weary,
and drove back the enemy with a fire that seemed drawn from the very roots of the mountains. The sight of them upon the walls, calm amid the chaos, gave strength to the hearts of the defenders and filled the enemy with unease. For in them lived yet the unbroken will of Numor. For 3 days and nights the battle raged without pause, and the fields before Fornost were turned to mire with the blood of the slain. Yet still the walls held, and the banners of Arnor yet flew, tattered but proud, defying the darkened sky. But the Witch-king had not unleashed the full measure of his power, and in the dark of the 4th night he called forth a new horror from the pits of Angmar. The earth trembled as a great siege engine, black as night and wrought with the craft of sorcery, was drawn forth by beasts unseen by mortal eyes. It was a ram-shaped, in the likeness of a wolf's head, and its M was swathed in flame. With terrible force it was driven against the gates of Fornost, and with each blow the very stones of the city shook, and the hearts of men quailed. Elendil, standing upon the inner walls, watched as the ancient gates, which had withstood the assaults of centuries, began to splinter and crack beneath the relentless pounding. He knew then that the hour of final trial was come. Calling to him the last of the royal guard, he prepared for the defense of the citadel itself, where the last stand of the Dúnedain would be made. The gates burst apart with a crash like the fall of mountains, and the hosts of Angmar poured into the city. The defenders fought from street to street, from house to house, their swords flashing in the firelit gloom. But they were too few, and the enemy too many. Slowly, inevitably, they were driven back toward the heart of Fornost, toward the ancient halls where once the kings of Arnor had held court, beneath banners of blue and silver. Elendil and Melor led the defense with a valor that was sung of long after in hidden halls and lonely hearths, where the last of the Dúnedain gathered in the dark years that followed. Time and again they rallied the broken ranks, and where they fought, the enemy faltered. But even heroes cannot stand against the tide forever, and the walls of the citadel, strong though they were, could not long withstand the relentless fury of Angmar. At last, seeing that all was lost, Elendil gathered about him the remnants of his people. There in the high hall of Fornost, beneath the fading banners of his house, he spoke to them for the last time, his voice clear and unwavering. "My friends, my brothers," he said, "the day has come when the flame of the North Kingdom shall be extinguished. Yet we shall not go into that darkness cowering like beasts, but shall meet it as men of the West, as sons of Numor, whose hearts were never bent to the will of evil. Let them say who come after, that here we stood and fell, and the shadow passed over us, but did not break us." Thus they made ready for the final defense. The great doors of the hall were barred and braced, the windows sealed, and the last company of the Dúnedain, weary and bloodied but unbowed, arrayed themselves in a circle about Elendil, their swords gleaming in the ruddy light of the torches. The Witch-king himself led the final assault. Clad in black armor and crowned with iron, he strode through the broken gates of the citadel, his presence a living terror that bent the will of all but the strongest. At his side came his captains, wraiths and sorcerers, and behind them the rabble of orcs and men baying like wolves, scenting their prey. The doors of the hall shuttered beneath their blows, and at last, with a thunderous crash, they gave way. Elendil stood before the throne, Narthalon in his hand, and his captains about him. He raised his sword in salute, and for a moment even the Witch-king paused, for the light of the Eldar seemed to shine about him. Then, with a cry, Elendil charged. The clash within the high hall of Fornost was like the breaking of a thunderstorm upon the mountain heights, fierce and without mercy, and the light of torches danced upon the walls as steel met steel, and the cries of the dying echoed beneath the vaulted roof. Elendil, heir of the kings of Arnor, hurled himself into the fray with a fury that seemed more than mortal, and about him the last defenders of the north gathered, a dwindling circle of valor and defiance standing against the relentless tide of shadow that poured through the sundered doors. With Narsillion flashing in his hand, Elendil hewed down foe after foe, his blade a shining arc of vengeance against the black-clad warriors of Angmar. At his side, Malar fought like a storm-driven oak, unyielding even as the ranks of the enemy pressed closer and closer. Time seemed to falter in that bitter struggle, and the hall that had once been a place of song and judgment was now a field of death, where the blood of men and orcs mingled upon the ancient stones. Yet for all their courage and all their strength, the defenders were too few, and the Witch-king, towering above the melee, moved among them like a shadow of despair. His voice, cold and terrible, rang through the hall, sapping the will of the living and binding their limbs with unseen chains. One by one the defenders fell, each taking with him many of the foe. But the circle grew smaller, and at last only a handful remained about Elendil, bloodied and weary, yet standing still. Then the Witch-king advanced, and all the light in the hall seemed to fail before him. His sword, long and black, gleamed with a fell light, and his crown of iron seemed to burn with a fire not of this world. Elendil, seeing him approach, knew that his fate had come, but he did not flinch, nor did his hand tremble upon the hilt of his sword. Raising Narsillion high, he spoke in a voice that carried through the smoke and din, a voice filled with the memory of lost Numor and the pride of the Dúnedain. "Come then, servant of the void," he cried, "for though I fall, yet shall my spirit defy thee, and though this kingdom crumble, yet the line of Elendil shall not be broken." With that he sprang forward, and the two met in a clash that shook the hall to its very foundations. Long they fought, and those who beheld it spoke ever after of the might of Elendil, how he withstood the Witch-king when all others had fallen. But the shadow was too great, and though he wounded the enemy sorely, at last Elendil fell, stricken by a blow that broke the very stones beneath him. Malar, seeing his lord fall, gave a cry of rage and sorrow, and flung himself upon the Witch-king, seeking to avenge his king, even at the cost of his own life. He struck a mighty blow that clove the black helm of one of the captains of Angmar. But ere he could strike again, he was overwhelmed by the press of the enemy, and borne down beneath their swords. Thus ended the defense of the high hall of Fornost, and with it the last hope of the North Kingdom. The Witch-king stood over the fallen form of Elendil, and for a moment he was still, as though gloating over his victory. Then he turned away, and his dark host spread like a plague through the city, sacking and burning as they went. The houses of the kings were cast down, the ancient archives of Arnor were given to flame, and the sacred places were defiled by the tread of orc and trolls. Yet even in that hour of utter ruin, hope was not wholly extinguished. For unknown to the enemy, a few had escaped the fall. Rangers and children, women and old men, guided by secret ways beyond the reach of Angmar's grasp. They carried with them the memory of their people and the seed of future resistance. A slender thread of life that would one day, in far-off years, be woven anew into the tapestry of Middle-earth.
The black banners of Angmar were raised above Fornost, and the Witch-king claimed the city for his own. But he could not claim the spirit of the Dúnedain, which passed beyond his reach into the wilds in the hidden valleys. Thus was the final fortress fallen, and the North Kingdom was laid waste. Yet the tale was not ended, for the hearts of men are not so easily conquered, and from the ashes of their ruin would arise a new hope, though many long years must pass before the shadow would be broken and the line of the kings restored. And so ends the telling of the fall of the Seven Fortresses, but not the story of the Dúnedain. Long after the last fires of Forno guttered into cold ash, and the black banners of Angmar were raised above the sundered walls, the land lay silent beneath a heavy gloom. The hills, once green and filled with the laughter of free folk, were now empty and desolate. The woods were thick with mist and the foul breath of orcs, and the rivers ran dark beneath the shadow of the Witch-king. Yet though the stones of the cities were thrown down, and the halls of the kings were dessoiled, the spirit of the Dúnedain was not broken. And in secret places, hidden from the enemy's gaze, the last of the faithful gathered. In the deep woods of Elendil, where the waters of Lake Ninual mirrored a sky heavy with grief, the remnants of the North Kingdom found refuge. Few they were, a broken remnant, no longer arrayed in the proud arms of old, but clothed in simple raiment, carrying what little they could bear from the wreck of their homes. Rangers and hunters, women and children, old men bowed by sorrow, yet unyielding in heart. All came by hidden paths to that place of shelter, drawn by the ancient call that still lingered in the land, whispering that all was not yet lost. It was here that Have, a captain of Elendil's household, and among the last to flee the sack of Fornost, took up the charge of leading the survivors. His face was lined with sorrow, and his eyes bore the shadow of all he had seen. But his will was strong, and in him burned the fierce pride of those who refused to bow to the darkness. By his counsel, the refugees made their camp beneath the shelter of ancient trees, building no towers nor walls, for they knew well that strength of arms would not avail them against the might of Angmar. Instead, they became a people of the wild, living by craft and secrecy, moving lightly upon the land and vanishing into the mists when danger approached. They watched and waited, gathering lore of the enemy's movements, guarding the old paths and the ancient tombs, and teaching their children the history of their people, lest the memory of Arnor be lost with the crumbling of its stones. Songs were sung in the twilight, soft and sad, of Elendil the Tall and of the great days of Numor. And though tears often accompanied the singing, yet the songs endured. A thread of gold woven through the dark cloth of their exile, even as they hid in the fastness of the wild, the Witch-king's dominion spread. Great fortresses were raised upon the bones of fallen cities. Roads that once carried the banners of the North Kingdom now bore the tread of orcish warb bands, and the land itself seemed to wither beneath the weight of his malice. But the Dúnedain did not forget. In secret councils beneath the stars, your vigil and the chieftains of the scattered clans spoke of the days to come, when the darkness might be challenged and the free peoples of Middle-earth might be roused to war once more. For even in defeat, the Dúnedain held to a hope that was deeper than memory and stronger than sorrow. The hope that the line of the kings had not wholly perished, that somewhere, hidden from the enemy's eye, a seed had been preserved that would in time bear fruit. Indeed, few knew it then, but before the final fall of Fornost, Elendil, perceiving the end, had sent forth his young kinsman, Aaron, a youth swift of foot and keen of mind, to flee southward with a handful of guardians. In him the blood of Elendil ran pure, and though he was but a boy when the towers fell, his heart was filled with the wisdom and courage of his forebears. By secret ways they had escaped the grasp of Angmar, passing through the ruined wilds to the lands beyond the weather hills, and there they bided their time, hidden among the simple folk who still clung to the old ways. Thus the line of Isildur endured, though the crown was lost and the scepter shattered. The Witch-king, though he held dominion over the ruins of Arnor, could not find peace in his triumph. The land itself resisted him, and the memory of the Dúnedain, though unseen, weighed upon his mind like a thorn buried deep. He sent forth spies and dark creatures to hunt the survivors, scouring the woods and the secret valleys. Yet always they found only empty glades and vanished trail. Whispers began to spread even among the dark armies that the spirit of the North was not wholly slain, that some remnant yet lingered beyond their grasp. And fear, that most insidious of foes, began to gnaw at the hearts of the servants of Angmar. In the hidden camp by Lake Nuya, Hervedel stood often upon a high ridge and gazed out across the misty waters, his thoughts heavy with the burden of all that had been lost. Yet when he turned to look upon the faces of the children playing among the trees, and the young warriors sharpening their blades in the twilight, a glimmer of hope stirred once more within him. For he knew that though the towers had fallen and the cities burned, the true strength of the Dúnedain lay not in stone or steel, but in the hearts of their people. And so the seasons turned, and the long years passed, and the world grew darker. Yet in the deep places of the north, the flame kindled by the valor of the Seven Fortresses still flickered, unseen by the enemy, waiting for the hour when it would rise again and cast its light across Middle-earth. For even in the deepest night, the stars endure. Thus it came to pass that the North Kingdom was broken, and the lands of Arnor fell into silence. A silence heavy with sorrow and the memory of deeds both great and grievous. The proud cities lay in ruin, the towers of watch and warning were thrown down, and the ancient roads was swallowed by forest and fen. The Witch-king, seated now in the halls of Carn Dûm, ruled a realm of fear and shadow, and for many years none dared challenge his dominion over the north. Yet even in those dark times, the line of kings did not utterly perish, nor did the hope of the Dúnedain wither away. For the survivors, though few and scattered, kept alive the memory of their fathers and the ancient oath sworn before the throne of Elendil. In secret, they taught their children the old lore, the tongue of Numor, and the songs of the Sea Kings, so that even though the land might forget their name, their blood and purpose would not be lost. Among them rose Aranar, son of Arvdui, last king of Eredain, and though he wore no crown and sat upon no throne, he became the first of the chieftains of the Dúnedain, leading his people not in power and splendor, but in hidden strength and steadfast will. From the wild places of Eriador, they watched the enemy, striking when they could, preserving the free folk from ruin, and maintaining the long vigil against the darkness that ever sought to creep southward. Thus a new life was born from the ashes of the Seven Fortresses, a life hard and full of wandering, yet not without hope. For it was decreed by the wise that the day would come, far off though it seemed, when the shadow would be broken, and the line of kings would return to heal the wounds of the north and renew the glory of the west. In secret, the rangers of the north, as they came to be called, kept the paths and guarded the borders, unseen and unsung, yet ever faithful. The sons of their line grew strong in silence,
tempered like the steel of the ancient blades they bore. Though the world forgot their names and their deeds passed into legend and fading memory, they endured, for they were bound by a purpose greater than themselves, the unyielding hope that the light of the West would shine once more upon Middle-earth. The stars wheeled slowly above the silent hills, and the seasons turned from winter to spring and back again. In lonely vales and under ancient trees the rangers passed, unseen by friend or foe, speaking the old words and keeping alive the secret flame. In their hearts was a sorrow deep as the sea, but also a fire that neither time nor darkness could quench. And so, though the Witch-king ruled in the north, and the lands of Arnor were a desolation, the final victory was not his. For the deeds of the Dúnedain, though hidden, was a thread of resistance through the long years of despair.
Their lineage was preserved, and with it the hope of the West, as a seed buried deep beneath the snows, waiting for the day of its flowering. Many long years would pass before that day came, and many would fall and be forgotten. Yet in the fullness of time, from among their number, would arise one greater than all who had come before, a king to reclaim the lost crown and renew the broken sword. And through him the north would be avenged and the darkness driven back. Therefore, though the 7 fortresses fell and the proud banners of Arnor were cast down into the dust, their spirit lived on in the hearts of the faithful, and their sacrifice was not in vain. For from ruin comes rebirth, and from ashes the fire is kindled anew. Thus ends the tale of the fall of the 7 fortresses, a tale of sorrow and of hope, of loss and of endurance, woven into the long song of Middle-earth, which neither darkness nor forgetting can wholly destroy. And beyond the circles of the world, where the light of the stars is never dimmed, the memory of their valor shall endure until the ending of days.